we're in good shape in terms of what the scripture is. But if you meet someone for whom inspiration is not a functional category, they don't believe in it, they don't understand it, they may not even be open to it, the ability to talk about how we are able in a sensible way to get from the event to its recording some 30 to 60 years later is really an important conversation. And the gap is a gap of time between the event and the time in which it is recorded. And for many, although not all, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are dated somewhere usually in the 60s, with Jesus's life in the 30s. So that's a 30-year gap in the case of 3 of the gospels. And then almost everyone dates John in the 90s, which puts you another 30 years down the road. And what skeptics do with this period is to say there are all kinds of things that can happen, all kinds of changes that can be made, etc. So when you're dealing with this period, you're really dealing with 3 factors. You're dealing with orality, how stories get passed on verbally from one person to another, because it's an oral culture, it's not a written culture, it's certainly not a digital culture. And books didn't become prominent in people's lives anyway until the medieval period. So most of what gets passed on and shared is shared by word of mouth. And in fact, for ancients, they believed that the testimony of the living word was more important than seeing words on a page. So that's the first factor. Second factor is memory. When you're dealing with periods that run as long as 30 or 60 years, you're into issues of memory and recall about those earlier events. And of course, the third link, and the key one that feeds into the tradition, is the way in which eyewitnesses participated in it, so that what is being recalled is tied to the testimony of people who actually experienced those events. So those are kind of the 3 categories I'm going to be dealing with. I like to talk about minding the gap, and I like to leave pictures in people's heads. So if any of you have ever traveled overseas or have gone to, say, New York, where there are subways, but particularly if you go to the London Underground, or you go to Sydney in Australia, where there's also an underground, and everything's backwards, there are all kinds of signs to help us poor Americans negotiate the British or the Commonwealth realities. And there's always this sign called "Mind the Gap." This gap is the space between the end of the subway platform and the beginning of the car that you're walking into. And they warn you, mind the gap, because there's a gap in between, and they really don't want you to drop into that space and have a sudden descent into Hades. And so the expression on all these subways is "mind the gap." So we're going to mind the time gap between a gospel event written in the 30s, a gospel event which takes place in the 30s, and the writing down of that event somewhere in the 60s all the way to the 90s. Some people date the synoptics after 70 in the 80s and 90s. It's still in that 30 to 60 year gap. So let me begin in making the point about this. An oral world is not a print or a digital world. In the beginning, there were no books. Okay, at least there weren't many of them. It was a very expensive operation. It was a very uncommon operation. In the beginning, there was the passing on of stories by word of mouth. And skeptics claim that this tradition was loose, like a thing called the memory game. The memory game is a game that you play. You tell a story to one person, they orally tell it to the next person, who tells it to the next person on down the line. The more people you have, the more times it's told. And the fun of the game is to see what the story was, what you started with versus where you end up. And usually there's a lot of movement in the story as it goes from the beginning to the end. I really like the name they have for this in Asia and in Oceania. This game, it's called Chinese Whispers. It's a different kind of game, and it tests people's recall, which makes it an interesting game. Bart Ehrman, who teaches actually in your part of the woods at North Carolina at Chapel Hill, says you can't trust what you get through the passing on of oral tradition. So he has doubts about oral tradition. And a second claim associated with this period is even if there were eyewitnesses, and someone like John Dominic Crossan, who was the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar, which is a big deal in the 1990s in historical Jesus studies, said that even if there are eyewitnesses, memory's not really trustworthy over time because it leaks. You don't remember well across time, and you mix things up, and you get timelines wrong and that kind of thing. So the argument is that things that were passed on in the context of an oral culture through memory, there's just lots of opportunity in the time frame that you're dealing with that's so large for things to get messed up. So that's what I'm going to be dealing with tonight. So let me give you some quotes that kind of show and give the spirit of what we're dealing with when people have questions about this oral period. Bart Ehrman has said in a work entitled The New Testament Historical Introduction to Christian Writings, which is probably in universities one of the most popular books on the study of the New Testament for New Testament introduction classes, says this: even the Gospels pose problems for historians, however, since they are written long after the facts they narrate by people who had not witnessed the events they describe and who relied on inconsistent oral and written traditions about Jesus. So you can see his complaints about the oral tradition at the end. You can see the introduction of the gap at the very beginning of that citation. And you can see a claim that the gospel writers didn't actually witness the events they described. Now, even if you take the traditional authorship of the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Ehrman wouldn't do that. But if you did, you still have to recognize that two of those writers, Mark and Luke, were not disciples of Jesus in all likelihood at the time in which he ministered, and probably did not witness the events that they were writing about, that the testimony that they pass on comes from somewhere else. In early church tradition, the traditions associated with Mark are associated with Peter and his preaching, which is actually a pretty important eyewitness. Peter is. So this is the way he presents the nature of the problem. And of course, any students who enroll in these classes and hear this think initially, oh, this makes sense. This might be something to think about. The second citation is from Michael White, who teaches classics at the University of Austin and was an advisor to a PBS special in the 1990s called From Jesus to Christ. And he states the problem this way: the problem for any historian of Jesus's life is that we don't have sources that come from the time of Jesus himself. Now, that is an interesting citation that is technically correct, but that also obscures something. It's technically correct in that none of the Gospels were written during the direct time of the events of Jesus' life. They were all written after he had been crucified. And so none of them come from, those don't represent sources that are in a direct time frame with the events that we're talking about. That's true. What the citation obscures, of course, is that they do come from sources in the tradition, some of whom were people who did walk and talk with Jesus. So it doesn't come from the time of Jesus himself, but it does come from people who were a part of the time of Jesus himself. So that's an important distinction to be making. But you can see in both of these citations how they are, by the way, this special was viewed by millions of people and gets aired regularly, usually at Easter time, on various educational channels on cable. So these quotes are designed to show kind of the challenge of what it is that we're dealing with. Now, so let me talk about orality first, and I have the name Bailey up there. It's a reference to Ken Bailey. Ken Bailey was a missionary in the Middle East who worked with Bedouin tribes. He worked with tribes that were, generally speaking, were not literate, did not write down the accounts of their history and that kind of thing, and worked with oral tradition. So he worked firsthand with oral tradition in a more modern form, but with a culture and a people whose practices go back centuries. So that's important to know. And Ken Bailey he also studied New Testament, and he said there really are three models for thinking about orality that exist. And these are the three models that do get discussed. The first is called informal and uncontrolled. There's no formality or structure to it. It's uncontrolled. Anyone can share the tradition. It just circulates with no oversight, and it can go anywhere. And the model of the memory game that Bart Ehrman is talking about has a model that is an informal and uncontrolled approach to orality. And in early historical Jesus studies, this was the model that was appealed to. And the example that was used for this appeal were folkloric stories coming out of Iceland. And I like to joke, well, at least they had the beginning of the name of the nation right. It had the letter I, but Iceland is not Israel. And it also comes from the medieval period. It doesn't come from the first century. So it's a very detached culture in a very distinct genre. Nonetheless, the initial discussions of orality dealt with this informal and uncontrolled model. Later New Testament scholars came along and said, wrong context, wrong way to think about this. Think about this in relationship to the rabbis. Now, the rabbis are from the right region. They're from the Middle East. And they're also at about the right time, because the rabbinic tradition emerged in the 2nd century AD. So we're pretty close, in fact, almost right up against the time of Jesus. And the argument here is that orality, which we see in works like the Mishnah and the Talmud, the works that reflect on Jewish law and Jewish practice, is formal and controlled. It's very precise, and only certain ones can tell the story. So it's a much more controlled model. And there were New Testament scholars pushing back on the uncontrolled model who said this is the way that it worked. The only problem with this, as wonderful as this would sound if this were the right background, and the Jewish background is important here, is that it was too precise. It didn't reflect what we actually see in the Gospels. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow night. But one of the challenges of the Gospels is they'll tend to tell the same story, but they won't tell it exactly the same way. There are differences as well as overlaps that you have to deal with in the Gospels. And so that model, even though it was proposed, and even though it was culturally closer to the first century, didn't seem to reflect in its product what we have in the Gospels. And so people raise questions about it. So Ken Bailey came along and said, well, let me tell you what I've experienced with the Bedouin tribes that I interact with and that I minister to for years. And he described what he called an informal and controlled process. So here's what he means. Anyone can tell the story, and the story is told with some variation, but the gist of the story remains consistent enough because of the oversight of the story that takes place by the elders of the community. And they oversee the story, and if it deviates too much, they correct the telling. So this is informal on the one hand and controlled on the other. There's some variation in detail in what the story is told, but the gist or the core of the story remains the same in how it's told. And he called this informal and controlled. And today, many scholars who think about this oral period think this model is the closest that we have and reflects the kind of thing that may have been going on in the first century. It's from the right region, the time is later, but the culture that it reflects is old and consistent and going way back. And so that's why people will put those together. So Bailey was claiming that the New Testament was this third type of informal and controlled orality, being passed on from generation to generation in the Bedouin tribes, story told with some variation, but the gist of the story remains the same, and there are elders in the community who oversee how the story gets passed on from generation to generation. So that's what I'm going to say about orality. Let me turn my attention to memory. The name here that you see in parentheses is Robert McIver, who wrote a big study in the beginning of this decade. He's Australian, on memory and memory studies of memory and the New Testament. He actually lived next door to me during my last sabbatical in Tübingen. He did his work while he was in Tübingen. So I got to know him personally while he was writing this work. Anyway, I need to tell you a story to set this up. Many, many years ago, probably in the 90s, maybe even the late 80s, I participated in a seminar at Southern Methodist University at SMU that was a discussion on memory, and it was John Dominic Crossan, the co-chair of the Jesus Seminar, and myself, along with some other panelists. Crossan got up and did a presentation on memory in which he basically took the position that I just mentioned to you at the beginning of the lecture. Yes, there may have been eyewitnesses. Yes, they relied on memory, but we need to remember that memory leaks and that memory is problematic. And he did this by appeal to a very famous study that took place at Emory University in Atlanta during the Challenger disaster. Now, for those of you who are old enough, you know that the Challenger was the space shuttle that exploded on launch. And the way that particularly tragic was, that wasn't a shuttle that just had astronauts on it. It had a junior high science teacher who was going to teach a class on science from the shuttle while in space. So this was particularly traumatic. It was one of the most public failures of the space program we've ever had, and it was known as the Challenger disaster. So what Emory did to test memory was to call in students their freshman year and ask them, where were you when the Challenger exploded, and how did you hear about it? Basically, those were the two questions that they asked. 3 years later, on the premise that these students would be seniors and be leaving campus soon, which may or may not be a good premise for how college students proceed through their education, they invited these freshmen back when they were seniors and asked them the same two questions. And then they compared the results. In about half the cases, the results were different. What they told them as a senior did not match what they told them as a freshman. And then they took that group and they asked them, here are the two versions that you have told us about how you remembered this. And they asked them which was the better version. And most of them inevitably picked the version they gave most recently, not the version that was up against the event. So Crossan made the point, see, memory leaks. We don't remember the way things we originally remember them. It changes over time, and this study shows it. So I was asked to respond to this presentation, which I was hearing about this experiment for the first time. And I made a couple of observations in responding. One was that it is one thing to randomly ask people not connected to the event that is taking place, even though it's a traumatic event, what their memory is, versus asking someone who's involved at NASA in the program. I said I'd be more impressed with Crossan's presentation if they had asked NASA astronauts and NASA engineers about this experience, because they were closer to it. And then the second observation that I made is, and the disciples are more like the people at NASA than they are like Emory students who are freshmen and seniors. And I posited, although I said I couldn't prove it, that if you involve someone in this study who had something directly at stake in what took place, their memory and their detail process would be better. Now, subsequently, there have been studies that have been set up this way, and that point is generally speaking true, that if someone has an interest in what it is that they recall or a stake in what it is that they recall, they tend to remember better than they would if they're just a random person looking at a particularly significant public traumatic event, but something that they're not really directly involved in. McIver made some other points in his work, including the observation that after 5 years, a significant event is remembered and its gist is retained in basically that form from that point on. In other words, the variations that you get in memory happen in the initial period, but once it solidifies after about 5 years, it tends to take on that form more permanently. And he says the studies tend to show this. The other thing that's important that makes the gospel stories different is you're not talking about an event that happens and then you don't recall it or talk about it or tell it until you write it down. Okay? You know, you pass it on orally. These are gospel stories. They're stories about Jesus that were shared in church some of those events would have been shared over and over and over again, just like today you might hear certain passages in the Gospels over and over and over again. So this gap isn't as big and unconnected as people present it to be. And then another feature that makes it a little different is what I'm going to call corporate memory versus individual memory. When you're dealing with events tied to Jesus, it isn't usually a matter of what one person has to remember for the sake of everybody, but it's what many people have to remember for the sake of everybody. There's a corporate memory. So it operates a little differently than individual memory, which is the way all these experiments were based. So all these features are designed to wrestle with how the gospel production is like or unlike the study of memory, and particularly individual memory. One of the things that does happen with memory that's important is that you get the mix of past event and present needs, but that fact does not cancel the historicity of that event, because historicity has a function of depth associated with it. And when we present memory as if it's either only about the past event or only about present needs, we distort the relationship and connection between past events and their significance, which is part of the history story. Great simple example of how to illustrate this. Many of you are sports fans and you'll watch a game, and a turnover will happen with one team having the lead. And it may be in the context of a series of things that have just happened in the game. And the announcer goes, Mo has possibly changed here with this turnover. We may be changing the direction of the game and who's got the advantage. Now, if that happens in, say, the beginning of the third quarter, you actually don't know whether that is in fact the case until the game plays itself out. So what I mean by historicity having depth is that historicity isn't only a matter of what happened at the time. Historicity is also a matter of the effect of that event across time. And you can talk about its historicity and its effect and talk about historically what it is and its impact. And that won't just be located at the time at which the event happened. So with that in place, with that issue of memory in place and the thinking through the way in which memory works for eyewitnesses in place, I want to think about examples of oral memory. One of the things that I did in thinking about this topic is to ask myself, where are there examples today of people who have to exercise oral memory as opposed to having the advantage of a written text or a digital memory or being able to Google something like that? And what struck me was the way my grandkids function, and in fact, the way my kids function with their evening stories. Until my kids were about 5 or 6 years old, and the same is true of my grandkids, they couldn't read. The stories that they recalled and the things that they remembered strictly on an oral basis. So when my kids were growing up, and this is also true of my grandkids, when we were around them, we used to read them an evening Bible story. And they were done in rhyme, and there was a wonderful set of books produced by a Lutheran publisher, Concordia. And you know the ritual of reading to kids at night when you have young kids. If you're like families like ours, we had a library and we had a bookcase that had their books in them, and we would ask them, okay, what story do you want to read tonight? And kids oftentimes developed a favorite story, which meant that the ritual of reading them a story night after night meant that you had to read the same story night after night after night, which for the adult is not necessarily the most thrilling thing to be doing. I mean, it gets repetitive. So I have a little bit of a mischievous streak in me. And so what I used to do with the kids every now and then when I would read the story, just to see if they were hanging in there and following it, is I would change the rhyme. I would change the story. And my kids and my grandkids always did the same thing when I changed the story, because they had heard the story enough to know the story, because it had been repeated on several occasions. And they would go, either Daddy or Opa, that's not how the story goes. And they would do it pretty insistently that I had done something, that I had broken some cosmic law, some cosmic rule. And then in many cases, not only would they tell me what I said that it was wrong, but they would correct me. They would tell the correct rhyme and line of the story. My grandkids did this with Star Wars. You literally could almost stop a Star Wars movie at a certain point, and I could say to them, "What's coming next?" And they could tell me, even down to what it was that the characters would be saying and what it is that the characters would be doing. Another more general example of oral memory that we deal with is family and friend memory at the point of a death. When people gather together and they remember someone who's been significant in their life, they don't go to a bookshelf, pull down a book and say, "Here's the biography of his life. This is what happened." They pull their stories out of their memory and the impact of the person that the person had on them, and they tell it. And if you're in a circle of friends when this is happening, you've probably had this experience as well. Someone will tell a story about a particular event, and if another person was at that event, they'll tell what they remember about it alongside. And those details won't always match. There'll be slightly different perspectives and angles on them, but they're talking about the same thing and the same event. That's how oral memory often works. I once gave this lecture in New Zealand, and someone came up to me afterwards who had been a medic in a military context and said, if you talk to people in the Army about the recollection of their experience, what they remember and what they highlight is very much related to the kind of military role that they exercise. It brings in the issue of related perspectives at the same event. So all these things are ways to think about memory and what memory does. So what I'm saying to you is that we have to mind the gap, and we mind the gap by realizing this is corporate memory of events that were repeated over time by eyewitnesses who were there and then passed on to other people. And there were ways of doing this to keep the story consistent and coherent and to keep the gist of the story in focus. Now, I want to add one other thing to this picture. I want to think about how far back can we push the core date of what is believed about Jesus in relationship to what we see in the Gospels. And the answer to this question is, when it comes to the core teaching of who Jesus is in the church, we can actually push this date back pretty hard. As I mentioned to you, the Gospels are written 30 to 60 years after the time of Jesus. But if you think about Paul's experience and Paul's letters, which declare his Christology and his commitment to Jesus and a high Christology, those works began to be written in about 49. So we go from 30 years after the event to 15 years after the event. And then if we think about Paul's own personal experience on the Damascus Road, which is recounted for us by Luke in Acts, that experience actually backs up to somewhere between 18 months to 2 years within the time of the events himself, with Paul having been in Jerusalem in the years immediately after the crucifixion as he was persecuting the church. And then here's the key part. In order for Paul to process the vision experience that he had of Jesus, he had to have heard the message of the apostles that he was rejecting before that experience, which means it predates his experience. So now all of a sudden, with regard to core Christology, we're literally right on top of the events themselves in the very city and context in which they happened. That's why the Saul to Paul story matters, because what is written in terms of the core Christology of what the Gospels represent actually goes all the way back right up against the events of Jesus themselves in the very region where it happened. All that's very, very important in thinking about the totality of the picture of what the Gospels give us. And of course, when we see in Acts 1 who took the place of Judas, what a qualification for an apostle was, the qualification is they had to have been with Jesus from the beginning. They had to really know what Jesus said and taught. And the apostles were the source of and the guardians, the initial guardians of this tradition, this oral tradition that we're talking about. That's part of what made it controlled. So here's what I'm saying. Orality is a different kind of remembering. It's not something we're used to doing today. And we are sloppy oral memory retaining people, because we have lots of other means of doing memory work other than having to memorize it or hear it repeatedly, those kinds of things. Oh, let me give you one other example of oral memory that I think you'll connect with. No one learned the words of Amazing Grace this way. Pastor got up in the pulpit and said, next week we're going to sing the hymn Amazing Grace. I want you to go home and memorize the verses of Amazing Grace so you can sing them next week. You learn the words of Amazing Grace by singing it again and again and again and again in a repeated way, so much so that if I go, the words pop in your head. That's an example of oral memory. So oral memory is a different kind of memory, especially when it gets repeated on a regular basis. When one is used to oral memory, it is generally speaking done better. And there are studies that show this. It's not the telephone game. It's not Chinese whispers. And the core can certainly be passed on from telling to telling. So the minding of the gap is not as great a problem as it's made out to be in the way it was initially framed when I presented it at the beginning of the lecture. And the importance of Paul is he knew the debate, he knew the events, he knew the tradition, and he was in Jerusalem at the time. That's important to know about his conversion and what that does for the gap in terms of the core Christology. So this is not the telephone game. It's something able to be remembered. And the other thing to remember is what is repeated over and over again by many has a better chance of being recalled over time. And with that, I'm done. So let me, well, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, at this time, we'd like to ask you if you have any questions to use the Q&A at the bottom and drop in some questions, and Dr. Bock will take a few minutes to answer those.
Okay, so how would your approach to memory and gospel accuracy compare with the approach of Dale Allison? Thank you. Yeah, Dale Allison is another historical Jesus scholar whose major concern is less about the discussion of orality as it is thinking about the historicity issues tied to the influences that impacted the tradition, what gets remembered, why it gets remembered, those kinds of things. The people that I am connecting with in terms of the way memory is being handled isn't just Kenneth Bailey, but a well-known British scholar who recently passed away, Jimmy Dunn, wrote a book called Remembering Jesus. The model of memory that I'm talking about is the model of memory that he espouses. And so, so Dale Allison is dealing with, part of the question that Dale Allison is dealing with, the impact of how present concerns help people or determine the kinds of things that they keep talking about and what they remember, which is certainly a part of what is going on in the gospel tradition, but it's not the only part of what goes on in the gospel tradition. And then a huge debate that happens between historical Jesus scholars is whether the early church injects things into the teaching of Jesus that are their concerns that weren't the concerns of Jesus himself. But if you read the Gospels very, very carefully, most of the disputes that you see in the Gospels are about things like who can forgive sins, how do we behave on the Sabbath, what's clean or unclean food, those kinds of questions. Those questions, generally speaking, were not questions of the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the early church. They were questions about the very Jewish environment out of which Jesus came. And so I think the Gospels give evidence of being deeply rooted in the time frame and in the historical and ethnic context in which Jesus functioned. Okay, next, another anonymous attendee. I don't know if this is the same person or not, since they have the same description. Don't we always remember as story? And how does that explain the different stories of the gospel? Well, let me just talk about narrative in general. Whenever we're constructing narrative, everyone who tells a story tells it in light of the way they remember it, that kind of thing. And what they retain and what they remember and what they're concerned about is a function of the things they are concerned about. So we tend to remember stories, and we tend to remember the characteristics of stories and the core characteristics of what someone taught. Let me make an analogy. Years ago, I was up in Michigan teaching PhD students. I was a guest lecturer at Michigan and dealing with a class that was in historical Jesus studies, among other things. And the professor who was hosting me was Jewish and had a lot of skepticism about the Gospels. And he made the point, very much like Bart Ehrman did in his citation, written later by some people who weren't there, etc. So it's hard to know if what we have in the Gospels, because it's so late and so detached from the original circle, that it goes back to Jesus. And this is someone who doubted the traditional ascriptions of authorship as well. So he didn't think any of the gospel writers were necessarily connected to the tradition. So it happened that in the room there were 12 students who had been together with this professor for years. And so I turned to him and I said, look, I said, the issue in the end is not who writes the material. The issue in the end is the quality of the tradition and where it comes from. If I were to ask these 12 students what themes you have in your teaching, because they've been in many of your classes, do you think they could reproduce what it is that you taught? And if they were together with you for years, do you think they would be able to adequately summarize the emphases in your teaching? To which obviously the transparent answer is yes. So I say, think about the apostles in this kind of way. Even if we accept the premise that there isn't an apostolic author of a gospel, but it's part of a tradition that goes back to the apostles, people who walked and talked with Jesus, is it likely that those apostles who spent years with Jesus would know whether he claimed to be the Messiah versus claiming merely to be a prophet, or knowing that he claimed to have authority versus claiming that he didn't? Isn't that just like the students who sit in your class for a few years and have exposure to you? So to me, the value of thinking through this is actually thinking through what it means for the apostles to have traveled itinerantly with Jesus, who went from place to place, taught the same things from place to place on a regular, repeated basis as he moved from one location to another. And this would have been embedded in their understanding of who Jesus is. Okay, another question. Regarding differences in the synoptics, how do you think through what might be attributed to intentional shaping by the author versus being remembered differently? Well, I actually think you have both of those things that could be going on. My lecture tomorrow, Elijah, is going to deal with issues of differences between the Gospels and the variety of ways that they may work. So I'm going to address this actually more tomorrow night, because tomorrow night what I'm looking at in some detail is how the synoptics work versus how John works, and they work very differently. So how do we explain that difference? I'm going to try and explain it tomorrow by the different approaches of the author, by the factors of the intentional shaping that they have, the kind of story that they tell and what they're concerned about, why they tell it, versus and that being a factor in the kinds of details, differing details that the writer has. Marty, no question. Just only affirming your key insight that I can think be summarized as key life events are seared into your memory and told so often that the words become repeated as if they were written down. You got the point, a major point of the lecture. Thank you very much. Next one. This is from Valdemar. Please comment on the importance of community and the testimony of the church. Complex question. And that is because some people say that these memories are formulated or in some cases created by the community. I don't think that's going on so often. But the function of community in the testimony of the church, particularly when we're dealing with apostolic oversight, is you have several people who walked, talked, and lived with Jesus over a period of time who can retain what he taught, pass it on, and oversee it all at the same time. I guarantee you, as the Gospels were sent out and circulated officially among the churches, that it wasn't a case of anyone wanting to send a FedEx passage to a church and saying, here's a gospel. What happened with the Gospels was someone wrote it down, someone who had the credentials to write it down, it was received in the church, it was copied and passed on from church to church, and I think that's the major way in which it likely would have worked. That is a community function, oversight function, that was built in to the apostolic office. And so for that reason, it was important. Ray Penoyer, who I know, so hello, says, what are we to make of Q? Was this a written collection or some kind of oral composition prior to the composition of the canonical Gospels? Okay, I've got to explain this to people who don't know who Q is, or as my wife says, who or what is Q and who cares? So Q is a posited source of Jesus's teaching that comprises around 225 shared verses of Jesus, primarily of Jesus' teaching, almost exclusively Jesus' teaching, shared between Matthew and Luke. It's teaching that doesn't come from Mark, and it's teaching that overlaps between Matthew and Luke on the premise, this is important, that Matthew didn't use Luke and Luke didn't use Matthew. So the assumption is that they didn't know or use each other, and there are reasons for positing that. Look at the differences in the infancy material, the differences in theme, the way in which the Sermon on the Mount is handled versus the Sermon on the Plain, etc. Okay? So if Matthew and Luke didn't use one another, but they share 225 verses, where did those 225 verses come from? To which the next question is, that's a good question, and that looks like they shared a source. Now, if you actually analyze the Q material in detail, which I've done, and which many others have done as well, it works out about this way. About 50% of it is very close in the overlap. Another 25% of it is close, but not exact, more like a paraphrase. And then the other 25%, you might debate whether it actually overlaps or not. There's debate about how wide, how many verses this source actually entails. So I tend to think something like Q had to exist because I don't think Matthew used Mark, or Matthew used Luke, or Luke used Matthew. Having said that, I think the mixture of what we see within Q makes it hard to think of it as a written collection only or an oral collection only. It is a tradition stream that Luke and Matthew share, that it could very well be a combination of written sources and oral sources, of written pieces, if you will, and oral sources that aren't overlapping with the written pieces, that kind of thing. That's actually how I tend to think about Q. I think Q is a likely part of the likely source. It's part of the circulating tradition. Why don't we have Q anymore? Because once it got incorporated in the Gospels, you didn't need it anymore. Okay, so it got lost in the wash, if you will. Roland Grams, my experience writing a missionary biography of my parents' ministry 50 or 60 years earlier, before I was born for the most part, agrees with your observations. We had eyewitness testimony that could recall weather, time of day, and short dialogues. One difference is that I was not trying to argue theologically that the Old Testament was being fulfilled in the historical telling of your story. Well, that's nice, because then your parents wouldn't have just been missionaries. They would have been something else. Anyway, how would you respond to the claim by some that the story of Jesus is sometimes shaped by the Old Testament more than the historical event? Andrew Lincoln argues that stories about wine god Dionysius influenced John's telling of the story of turning water into wine. Did other literature influence the historicity in ancient biographies? It might have, but it didn't influence it in the direction of creating a story where one didn't exist. it may have allowed for the introduction of parallel themes, which allows one to say Jesus is a better version of the kind of story that you're hearing in your larger culture. That is, to me, seems to me to be quite possible. Okay, Reverend Stephen Sevilla asks, where does the remembering begin? Acts 2:4 says they devoted themselves, it's actually 2:42, I think. Anyway, Acts 2:42 says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayers. Well, the remembering actually would have begun before then, even, because that's Pentecost. It would have happened in the midst of Jesus' ministry. It would have happened in the midst of them walking and talking about what it is that Jesus had just taught, or what it is that Jesus just did, which then becomes the apostles' teaching and fellowship, which gets reported and focused on in the teaching of the churches, which of course is what Acts 2:42 is talking about. The descriptions and the discussion must have been so significant as to burn into the memory. And that's the point, my point about repetition. These are things that are repeated. They're told again and again. They were reflected on at various times as they were traveling with Jesus from place to place, and he would repeat the same things in different locations. They got reinforced. There's just lots of ways for these things to be seared into the memory. Vladimir responded, thank you. I really appreciate your teaching. You're welcome. I'm glad to have had the time to be able to interact with you. And I'm down to one final question, it looks like. How should we argue for the historical authenticity of the saying of Jesus? For example, the exception clause in Matthew 5:19, when many scholars think the saying is a redaction by an author of the early church, do we use the criteria of authenticity, or is there a better method? I tend to work with the criteria as at least tools to think about this stuff. I think part of the question, the specific example that you have about the exceptional clause in Matthew 5:19, is that I sometimes say that one gospel writer has given us a more precise answer to a question than another gospel writer. That precision and accuracy are not the same thing, depending on intent. I think what's going on in Mark and in Luke is, when the question about divorce comes, that they are highlighting what Jesus emphasized, which is divorce, marriage by design was intended to be permanent. And that's what they highlight, and that highlights Jesus' emphasis in his teaching. Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 actually gives us the detail of the exception alongside, because he's being more precise or fuller or more complete in the answer that he's giving. At least that's how I would go after that question. And we know that Jesus must have said that there was some kind of exception, because when we come to 1 Corinthians 7 and Paul discusses marriage and the possibility of divorce, he has an exception beyond even what Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 mention. And if Jesus had, and he knows the Lord's teaching, because he says that he's giving his idea, not that of the Lord. So if the Lord had said there are absolutely no exceptions, he never would have gone there. Philip, given that Paul used scrolls to write letters, isn't it plausible the gospel writers did in fact write their respective gospels? The answer to that question is yes. The gospel writers did write on papyri, but they did it years later. We're talking about the conversation about those events before they ever sat down to write their gospels. So I'm not saying the gospels weren't written down. I'm talking about the period before the gospels were written down, backing up all the way to the event itself. Okay, I said earlier there was a final question, but the questions keep coming, so we just keep going. Andres asks, what kinds of differences and details in the synoptic accounts would be of no concern to the authors and original audience, yet upset many minor critics used to the preciseness of recorded media? Okay, I'm going to shift the question a little bit, because I think this is actually what's underneath the question that you're asking. Ancient writers presented events based on memory without the benefit of videotape, digital recordings, or any variation thereof. Okay, they did it off of their core memories, and it isn't that something might not be a concern to an author. It's just a function of how much they were able to retain as they passed on what they remembered. I do think that sometimes we as modern people read Old Testament texts for a level of precision they are never intending to communicate. I've actually written 2 articles about this, one dealing with the sayings of Jesus and one dealing with the Gospels in general. The first one was called The Words of Jesus, Live, Jive, or Memorex. And you got to be old to know what Memorex is. Okay. So that was one. And the point that I was making is, am I hearing it direct? Is it connected to what Jesus said? Is it jive? Is it made up? Or is it like a tape cassette? Go back to Memorex and what it actually was. And my point is, it's live, it's not jive, but neither is it like a tape cassette. Another way I like to say this is, when you think of the Gospels, you can think of the Gospels as a photograph, you could think of the Gospels as a painted portrait, or you can think of the Gospels as an abstract painting with Jesus as the subject. My own view is the Gospels are more like a portrait than they are like a photograph or like an abstract painting, okay? Because the portrait of Jesus coming through the 4 Gospels has hues to it and touches and tints, depending on which Gospel you're thinking about. And so it's not like a photograph because of the similarities and variation that you get at the same time, which of course is one of the challenges of what it is that the Gospel presents. So yes, I think sometimes critics produce problems for themselves about the Gospels because they're asking questions about the Gospels and what they're saying that they're not intending to address. Or they're looking for a level of precision from what it is that the Gospels say that is not like what they're able to address. And Corey got his question just in under the wire. Okay, so let me go to the next question. Do critical scholars like you cited, Ehrman, address the period of orality between the lives of other ancient figures, Alexander, and their written biographies, and what do they say about them? Yes, they do. People have studied orality and the relationship between orality and sources. The problem that you have with ancient writings about most figures is that most figures writing about ancient figures have a much larger gap than the 30 to 60 years involved with the gospel writers. In many cases, the writings that you're dealing with are dealing with centuries as opposed to decades, which changes the dynamic of the way all this works. So, and the other difference is that you're dealing with Hellenistic culture as opposed to Jewish culture, and Jewish culture, because of the importance of Torah and Torah teaching, was used to working with teaching content. That's another difference that you have to take into account. I think I've got one more question that's continuing to sneak in here as the anonymous attendee gets the award for the most questions asked. Who were your favorite students in baby Greek during the summer of 1983? And you don't look a day older. Well, you're nice. I look a lot older. I may have less hair, but it is certainly much whiter and grayer than it was in 1983. And I have no idea who my favorite students were in 1983, because my memory about baby Greek students is actually pretty lousy, because I don't think any of them impacted me with the impact that the Savior impacted my life with. So with that, I think I am done. Mark, the floor is yours.
And we want to thank Dr. Bock for joining us. It's a different format for us. We were so excited when he agreed to come, and we were hoping to get to see him in person, but we are grateful we were able to work this out. Thank you to our IT team for their work in making this happen. And we encourage you to be back tomorrow night at 7 for How the Gospels Work, and we'll conclude our series at that time. Speaking of technology, just want to remind you of the Cooley website. It's under the Engage menu on the Gordon-Conwell main page, and you can go there. And I think one of the questions earlier was this being recorded for future reference? And all of our lecture series events are on the Cooley website, so you can go and listen to our past events. And this one will be up soon, probably within the next week or two. And so I encourage you to check that out. There's a lot of resources there, links to different blogs and websites, bibliographies, and just all kinds of church resources. So I encourage you to check that out. And with that said, let me close us in prayer, and then we hope to see you tomorrow night. Dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this time in which we are given a reminder that your word is trustworthy. We're living in a very skeptical age where so many things are questioned, so many doubts seem to be out there. But there is one thing that we can always rest assured in, and that is the word that you gave us about you and your plan and your work in the world. And again, we're grateful for Dr. Bock and his willingness to share with us some information that gives us great confidence in the word that you have given to us. And we look forward to tomorrow night and pray you'll be with us in this very difficult and challenging times that we're living in. And we just praise you for your guidance and your protection in our lives. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Good evening. We'll see you tomorrow.